Okay, so I'm hoping this is working for you guys. They've slightly changed the way that YouTube Live works for me right now. So this is kind of a brand new thing for me, trying to figure out where all of the things I need on this are. So I'll start doing questions in just a moment if you'll give me just a couple of seconds to figure out if I have the ability to do fun things like, oh, I don't know, screen share? Is that something I can still do on this? I don't know, man. We'll see. Oh, looks like it's going to be okay. All right, so there's that. Okay. All right, so it looks like I probably can't screen share on this, which is kind of obnoxious. But if you have questions and you are watching right now, go ahead and ask your. So just a reminder as to how we'll do this, guys. I will be online from 5 until the questions run out or until 7 p.m., whichever one happens first. You need to have your study guide out for this unit so that you can go ahead and ask whatever questions you have. And you need to, yeah, that's basically what you need to do. So I already have some questions coming in via Remind. And yeah, so we'll go ahead and get to those. So let's see here. I'm going to start, I think. Let's see here. Oh, okay. Pardon me. Throat's a little bit dry. All right, so I have a question from Reed. Reed wants to know if I can explain unification in 1603 and its significance. So what he's referring to there with unification in 1603 is he's talking about the tying of Scotland to England, the unifying of the two of those countries into something that becomes sort of the structure that will eventually become the United Kingdom. So if you recall, the Kingdom of England up until the, let's see here, early 1500s, there had been a long period of constant warfare, about 100 years, frankly, of civil war in England called the War of the Roses. Very, very complicated stuff. And essentially what happened was the ascension of Henry VII ended the War of the Roses. Henry VII has a son, Henry VIII. Well, really, he has two sons, but one of them dies, so we don't care. Henry VIII takes the throne, and he doesn't have any sons, or no legitimate sons. And if you remember the video we watched about how to become King of England, you have to be not naturally dead. And if you are born outside of wedlock, according to the throne, you are, or according to the crown, you aren't naturally dead. So Henry's illegitimate male children couldn't inherit the throne, and he desperately needed a legitimate son. So that's what prompted the whole split with the Catholic Church and the development of the Anglican Church and the active supremacy as a result. Ultimately, after Henry VIII's ascension to the throne, and the splitting of churches and women through beheading, ultimately Mary becomes the first Tudor queen, followed shortly thereafter by her sister Elizabeth. Neither of them had children. Mary did marry, and she believed she was pregnant several times, but unfortunately never was. She died of either some sort of stomach cancer or uterine cancer, and she believed she was pregnant for the early portion of it, which is terribly tragic. But the problem was that Elizabeth died without children. So what she did was she borrowed her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots' son, James VI of Scotland, and basically said, hey, we're related, so I'm going to grab you and make you my heir, and then when I die, you will become king, not just of Scotland, but also of England. And that's the act of unification. And that's really the beginning of pulling together what becomes the modern United Kingdom. All right, so I do see that I have some people asking questions in the chat. That's super great. Keep that going. So I do have a few other questions on Remind I want to get to before I forget about them, because I have them kind of on a different screen over here on my tablet. So I'll address those, and then I will jump onto the questions that I'm seeing pop up in chat. But if you're afraid that you won't be able to watch for very long, or you're afraid you'll forget to ask the question, go ahead and put them in chat, and I will get to them. Okay, So let's see here. I have a question, I believe. There we go. I have several questions from Claire that I'm going to get to here. So Claire wants to know, first of all, what's the difference between a plurality and a majority? Okay, good question, because these are critically important terms, and we always want to make sure we're using them correctly. So when we say plurality, what we mean is that somebody has more votes than anybody else. Now, if you have like 7 parties running for a seat and it's a single member district, right? That means the votes could be split 7 different ways. And that means you could potentially win the seat with something like 27, 33% of the vote. So plurality doesn't mean that you have 50% plus 1. It just means you have more than everybody else, okay? Sometimes the term that we use to describe a political election that is plurality based is the term first past the post. Or you might hear the phrase winner take all. Either of those are acceptable. In the US, sometimes we use the term jungle primary just to confuse you, but they're all essentially the same thing. What they mean is that somebody has more votes than everybody else. But the differences between a plurality and a majority is that a majority is always going to be 50% of the vote plus 1 additional vote. All right. So the thing about having a plurality-based political system in a single-member districting, a districting system, is that you are inevitably going to develop a 2-party system. It is mathematically impossible for it to not happen, because eventually what happens is people get frustrated with their political systems, or they vote strategically, and this winnows the parties down essentially into 2 major options, because it doesn't really matter if that's really what people want. What matters is that the party that has the most people voting for it will always win. This is particularly problematic when you have minority votes. So majority systems often require runoffs, okay? They often require that people have to vote a second time around, okay? So that you get out the vote the first time and then a week later have to head back to the polls to vote again. All right, so hopefully that helps, Claire. That is a term you can expect me to use not just in this unit, but in every single unit going forward. So it's not information you should just like Control-Alt-Delete and get rid of, okay? That one's one you're definitely going to need in the future. Let's see here. Claire also wants to know, in what instance would abstract review be used, and why would it be used instead of doing concrete review? Okay, so Claire is referring to 2 types of judicial review. And the important thing to know, Claire, is that the type of judicial review is established usually by law in a country, or by practice if you're the UK and don't do that whole like written law thing. So in the US, we do not do abstract review, period, the end, we don't. The only type of judicial review we use is concrete review. And what that means is that in order to review whether or not a law is constitutional, you have to have an actual case, a case that proves harm, that shows why the law is in violation. You have to have an actual case to look at in order to overturn any kind of law in the US. You can't go on hypotheticals. It has to actively hurt someone first before you can change it, okay? That's why organizations like the NAACP or the ACLU look for test cases when they're trying to strike down particular laws. In the US, we do that because we have to show that, number one, it's a current thing that's ongoing, that the law is active. It can't be something that mattered back in like 1743 and really hasn't hurt anybody since. It has to be something that is current. It also has to be something that proves harm. So what you need is a case that clearly is that is active right now, that the person is still alive, still being harmed by it, and that you can show demonstrable harm. So when when we try to like push back against laws that we feel are unethical or unjust or unconstitutional, that's the standard in the US. In the UK, that is not what they do. Abstract review means that you can strike a law down without a test case, that you can say that in the abstract, this law is simply unconstitutional, or in the abstract, this law does not meet our judicial standards. So you don't have to have a test case in abstract review. In the UK, they use both. They use abstract review and concrete review. It is very unusual for a place to use just abstract review. Many places, the US for one, Nigeria for another, use concrete review. It's more unusual for a place to use abstract and concrete, partially because it's so much up to sort of the discernment of the justice as to whether or not it actually violates law. So that's one big problem, is like, how do you have a standard to prove harm if the law's never really gone into effect? So that's how people use them. But abstract review works perhaps better in the UK system, because the UK system isn't based on constitutional law, but rather common law, right? Their constitution is kind of this abstract mess of tradition as well as written law. So having perhaps an abstract means of sort of revising and looking at legal practice maybe makes more sense in the UK than it does here in the States. So that's one thing to consider. And then Claire had one final question here. She wanted to know, can a party list be used in an instant runoff voting, or are they two different systems? Okay. All right. So instant runoff voting is another term for ranked voting or alternative voting. And instant runoff voting is where you list the parties, or depending on how your system works, the candidate you would like your vote to go to. So I would say I'm going to vote first and foremost for Leanna, and then I'll vote for Claire if Leanna doesn't have enough to win. And then if Claire doesn't have enough to win, I want my vote to go to Chike. Okay, so like that's my order of ranking my vote. And it's an instant runoff system because I don't have to go to the polls again. They just look at my ballot, and depending on how it works out with the recipient of my vote and vote totals, they use a computer modeling system to determine whether my vote stays at the initial choice or if it drops down to my next ones. So that's how it's an instant runoff vote. The other term you used is a party list. So party list systems are more common when you have proportional representation. So remember, in a proportional representation system, the way it works is that you have a number of different parties who are running for national office, usually, possibly a multi-member district, depending on how you do it. And so you'd have like Green Party and Libertarian Party and Republican and Democrat and I don't know what else. The rent is too damn high party, whatever party you have. And essentially what happens is, if the Green Party gets 7% of the vote, then they get 7% of the seats in the legislative body. So this is where the party list comes into play. You have a list of Green Party candidates, and depending on the number of seats you get, let's say you got 7 seats, well, then the top 7 people on the party list get those 7 seats. So the party list is a way to rank order sort of the people you want in the legislative body. So if you are the head of the Green Party, you get to choose, oh, I think Claire should go first, and then Leanna, and then Chike, and then space, Zion. Sorry, Zion. So we kind of like, we rank order. And then if for whatever reason, like Leanna screws up and she makes the party mad at her, then you can take her off the list and you can put someone else in there instead. It's a way of maintaining party discipline in partial reality. I mean, that's what they use it for. So hopefully that clarifies for you. So Leanna, I'm going to go ahead and get to your question now because I've put it off for long enough. So how much of the test is political history? Well, good question. Here's what I do when I make the test. I look at your study session. I look at your study guide, and then I divide the different sections, and I include a section on Harkness readings, and then I divide that out by, so if it's like 7 questions, I divide 55 by 7, and that's how many questions will be on that subject. Give or take, whether or not I can either write really good questions on the subject, or if I can find released AP exam questions on that subject. So usually the test actually kind of follows the layout of the study guide in terms of the way it's organized. So if I start with political history, which I don't, how do I start? Let me pull it up real quick. I've got it here. I start with political ideology, and then I talk about democratic and democracy as institutions, and then models of democracy, and then competition and participation, and then I get to UK political history. The test as a whole actually will follow that order, like that. Those will be the subjects. In fact, if I'm not careful when I'm editing, you can still see the headers on them. So usually I would say probably not more than 7 questions on political history. And Leanna, it's going to be questions that are really important in terms of sort of shaping the political reality of the UK as it is today. So it's not going to be trivial stuff in terms of, like, you know, which king did Oliver Cromwell have beheaded? Although that's Charles I. But like, it's not going to be that sort of stuff. In fact, if there are questions about the monarchy, it's more likely to be, I'm so sorry, my ears itching me, and these headphones are really not helping. It's more likely to be stuff about how did the monarchy lose authority? How did Parliament gain authority? Like, those are the sort of questions that are more relevant to us in terms of doing an actual political analysis. So hopefully that helps. Okay. All right, so let's see here. What else have I got in terms of questions? I think, let me swap over here. All right, so I have a couple of questions from Brianna. Hi, Tessa. I see. Okay, since I was kind of on this topic, I'm going to answer Tessa's question now since it just popped up here. Tessa wants to know, are we going to need to know exact dates for political history? No. I don't even require that in my history classes. I require that you be able to sequence things. You should be able to get things within 100 years. And if it's like contemporary, like, I'm going to be frank, if it's modern politics, by modern, I mean post-World War II to the present, you ought to be able to hit the decade, okay? You should know that Margaret Thatcher comes to power. I mean, I won't expect you to know 79, but that is when she comes to power, that she's basically in power during the entirety of the 80s. Like, that's important. And it explains a lot of what's going on then. So you should know kind of the big, broad dates. And you should be able to sequence, like, does Tony Blair come before or after Margaret Thatcher? After. And does David Cameron come before or after Theresa May? Okay, so you should, like, be able to sequence things. That's more important than anything else, okay? All right. So I do have some questions here from Brianna that I want to get to. So Brianna wants to know a little bit about gerrymandering, up-down votes, collectivist consensus, and neoliberalism, Benito Mussolini, and the Golden Dawn. That's an interesting mix, but sure thing. Okay, so first and foremost, gerrymandering. So hopefully you remember a bit of this from your 9th grade year, if not from our lesson in class. But gerrymandering is the deliberate attempt to draw political lines, usually for districts that are single member, that benefit one political group over another. They're extremely common. They happen in all countries that have single-member democracies, and single-member districts, my apologies, and they happen here in the States, no matter whether or not we're talking about Democrat or Republican-held seats. So, like, throw out, if you've been kind of thinking, oh, that's a Democratic problem, that's a Republican problem, please get rid of that. That's incorrect. It's kind of universal. So what usually happens with gerrymandering is that people realize that by drawing specific borders, paying attention to demographics, the places where people live, you can lump certain voters together and split others. And what you try to do, if you are trying to maintain power through a gerrymandered district, what you try to do is you try to split the other guy's political base, fragment them up so they don't have many voters in one place. Or if you do have an area that is very heavily, say, Republican or very heavily Democratic or, I don't know, very heavily Libertarian, kind of an odd thing, but let's say you did. What you would try to do is if you were trying to get rid of the libertarian vote, and there were a whole bunch in one place, you would put a bunch of them in one district, and they would definitely get a seat there. Nothing you can do about that. But then you would take the other libertarians in the area and you would split them up in such a way that they would be the minority in all the other districts. So maybe the libertarians would get 1 seat and the Democrats would get 5. Okay, so that's gerrymandering. Now, there are ways to try and fix gerrymandering, a couple of things you can do. Number 1, you can require that state districts, that voting districts or constituencies be drawn by a bipartisan committee or a nonpartisan committee if you're talking about a multi-party sort of system, where people have representatives from every party present and then they draw the lines. Generally speaking, the districts then become very safe, not very competitive. And that tends to be pretty problematic too, that people, like, there's not much shift in power. Things stay pretty much as they are. That's just kind of how it works. So that's one thing you could do. You could outsource the problem and not let politicians draw their own boundaries and instead give it to, say, like a group of judges who will draw the districts. That's one thing to do. California has adopted that policy now. That's what they do. So you could do that. Or, and this was something suggested in the video that we watched in class, you could hire consultants, the same people who get hired to gerrymander districts, and tell them to draw districts that are deeply competitive and representative of people's like actual political inclinations. All of which sounds kind of dirty, and it is because it's politics, but that's how gerrymandering works. I highly recommend that you rewatch, say, the CPG Gray video on the subject. It's on the Unit 2 resource page on the blog. If you scroll down, you'll find it. It does a really good job of kind of going over it. It is an inherent problem with single member districts. You can get rid of it if you do proportional representation, but then people don't have local representatives. So it's kind of a choice. Do you want to get rid of gerrymandering and do proportional representation? Or do you want local representation? Like, the two things are things that are very difficult to reconcile, those two desires. The other question Brianna had was, what is an up or down vote? Up or down vote means yes or no. It frequently shows up on referenda, on initiatives, on ballot measures, and constitutional amendments. So, for example, currently in this coming electoral cycle for us here in the state of Georgia, we have 5 ballot measures to vote on. Count them, 5, which you should do your research on before you vote. Don't be one of those people who like Googles what is the EU after you vote. Do your research first. Okay. So there are 5 ballot measures coming up for the state of Georgia. It's an up-down vote. What that means is yes or no. And if there are more people who vote yes, then the measure passes into law. If it's down, then it doesn't. Okay. That's what we mean by an up-down vote, is it's just a straight up or down, like simple majority winner-take-all system, okay? That's usually how it works for, say, a vote of no confidence. That's an up or down vote. But if you hear me use that term, that's what it means. It just means yes or no. Collectivist consensus. I have answered this a million times in class, which means that y'all still don't understand it. So collectivist consensus is the period between 1945 and 1974 in the UK, where there was very little policy difference between the UK's Conservative Party and the Labour Party. Basically, they both set forward a social democratic policy of building up government institutions, creating more infrastructure, funding things like the NHS and retirement programs and stuff like that. It didn't really matter if the Conservatives or the Labour Party were in charge. I mean, there was some minor policy difference, but broadly speaking, in terms of the way they viewed political economy, it was pretty much the same. So yeah, that's collectivist consensus. It's the period between 45 and 74, where there is very little policy difference between the Conservative and Labour governments. Okay. Let's see here. In a moment. Here it's doing super weird things. Policy. Hang on. Okay. All right. So Leanna wants to know, how does initiative differ from referendum? Okay. All right. So referendum is broadly saying okay. So a referendum is where the government sets forth a vote that will be held by the people. In the UK, there have been three major ones relatively recently. So there was the referendum recently, obviously, to Brexit, the Brexit referendum. There was an alternate vote referendum held in 2011. That one failed miserably. And then there was the Scottish referendum on independence, which was held in 2015, I think. And that one also failed, but by about 55-45. Split. So a referendum is initiated by the government, okay? So by, David Mitchell said, all right, David Mitchell, my apologies, what am I talking about? David Cameron. David Cameron said, all right, we will have your Brexit vote. And here we'll do it, and it's an up-down vote. And it starts with the government, okay? So a referendum starts with the government. An initiative starts on public initiative. Sorry, I was about to start coughing. So an initiative starts where people usually sit around a petition. They get enough signatories for it. And in some states in the United States, if you get a certain number of signatories on a petition, the government has to let you vote on an issue. California is like that. The state of Georgia is not a public initiative state. So instead, we have a lot of things called ballot measures, which are basically referenda. That's what they are. Sometimes we vote on constitutional amendments. Frequently, we legislate through constitutional amendments in the state of Georgia, which there's a lot of reasons why we do that, but all of them are very complicated. So essentially, an initiative starts with the public. A referenda starts with the government. That's the big difference that you got to know, Leanna. Okay. Let's see here. One last question a couple of last questions from Brianna. Brianna wants to know, what is neoliberalism? So neoliberalism is an economic policy of free trade. It really kind of regained a lot of power and influence, say, in the early 1990s, contemporaneous with, say, Bill Clinton's presidency. So coming to power in 92, 93, okay? And it's also in the UK associated with the prime ministership of Tony Blair. Tail end of Margaret Thatcher, I suppose. But neoliberalism is essentially the embracing of free trade, laissez-faire economics, usually smaller government. It's usually part of it. In the US, a good example of neoliberal economic policies would be the creation of NAFTA. Yeah. In the UK, let's see here, increasing reliance on the European single market for the UK. That would definitely be part of neoliberalism. The neo portion to neoliberalism is predicated on the notion that this is classical liberalism, but with an understanding that maybe you shouldn't abuse your workers as badly as people did during the Industrial Revolution. That being said, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden there was no sort of abuse of or unfair labor practices going on, but that was kind of the push towards it. It also tended to be slightly greener, so there's that. Okay, couple of other questions coming from Brianna, and then I will get to the questions that are popping up online here that I can see under chat. So Brianna wants to know what the role of Benito Mussolini is and why he shows up on the study guide. Can't remember if I actually mentioned this in class or if I didn't, but he is mentioned in your reading, so I feel like he's fair game. So Benito Mussolini was the person who came up with fascism. He was the developer of fascism in the 1920s. So remember, when we think about fascism, when we try to answer the question, is the emphasis on excuse me, I'm so sorry. Is the emphasis on freedom, individual freedom or collective equality? Fascism's answer is just no. Fascism's answer is there is neither individual freedom nor collective equality, because fascism states that some people are part of the true nation and some people just aren't. And if you are not part of the true nation, then you have no seat at the table and there's no obligation to try and work towards either your collective equality or your individual freedom. So in that regard, Mussolini is important because he is the founder of this particular political ideology. Golden Dawn is a good example of a modern fascist group that has active political influence in countries like Greece. They have parliamentary seats in Greece. Now, back to the questions that are developing on the chat. So hang on a second. All right, so Tessa wants to know, can I please give some examples of how the power of the majority can be checked in democratic systems? Gosh, you know what? That sounds an awful lot like a short answer question that is on your study guide. Generally speaking, I don't lay those out, but a couple of things I would point out is when we're talking about power of majority, and we can talk about things that can, the question we should always ask ourselves when we say majority is, what are we talking about? Are we talking about power of majority in terms of pure numbers? Because mathematically, that is 50% plus 1. Or are we talking about power and the majority expression of power? Because that can be different. I mean, when you have only 50% of a population voting, then you can talk about the majority of that 50% voting. But does that really adequately represent the majority of all people in an area? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on what society we're talking about. But things I would consider about checking the power of majority. Gerrymandering is one way that you can check the power of majority. If you draw the lines right, you can get control of a legislative branch without having a majority of the vote. In the US, you can look at things like the Electoral College, right? You can also look at legislative systems that emphasize sort of the equality vote of different districts, not based on population, whereas instead of looking at, say, like having equal representation of certain numbers of people. So those are ways that you can deal with kind of limiting the power of the majority there. But beyond that, I'm not going to give you any more specific answers because that's the sort of thing you got to work through on your own. All right, let's see here. Benson wants to know what follows a vote of no confidence. So a vote of no confidence, remember, is how you remove a prime minister from power. So to remove a prime minister from power, you call for a vote of no confidence, which means you probably shouldn't do that unless you know you can win, because it's politically toxic to call for one and then not remove the prime minister from power. You are going to be in deep trouble if that's the case. So generally speaking, you only call for it if you are 100% sure that you can remove them from power. And then what you do is you motion for a vote of no confidence. I motion for a vote of no confidence. And then someone says, is there a second? And you say, I second. And then it's an up-down vote. And if the yeas have it, if you have enough votes in favor of removing the prime minister from power, then what happens in the UK, Benson, is that, number one, the prime minister is no longer the prime minister as soon as the vote is gavelled down. Poof, that's it. They have to move out of number 10 Downing Street by the end of the next workday, like for real. They have to like get a moving van out and like move their stuff out. They're gone. There's no slow transition period. And then what is required is in the UK, they have to hold national elections. They have to, because the prime minister was selected by the majority party. And clearly the majority party is undergoing some major problems to such a degree that their leadership is in question. So what is required is that there will be someone who steps into the role of prime minister as an interim prime minister. It's usually the deputy prime minister steps into that job, and they call immediately for national elections. They have to. They have to be held within about 6 weeks. So they hold national elections, and every member of parliament seat is up for re-election. So this is why you don't call for a vote of no confidence just because you're bored. You have to do it because you believe that there's something significantly wrong, that it would be politically toxic for you not to do so, or that it would be unconscionable for you to refrain. So you have to do it knowing that you may not get your seat back if you do this. So at any rate, yeah, that's what happens. It triggers a national election if you call for a vote of no confidence and win. Okay. Let's see here. I'm going to go to remind here, and I'm going to look at what Grace says. So Grace wants to know, can I explain what a mixed electoral system is and how it works? Okay. So Grace, a mixed electoral system is where you combine the processes of a single member district and a proportional system. Okay. Dang it, do I not have, I usually have, I'll draw on the back of this. Please excuse me. I'm going to use the some Lego instructions here that I happen to have out because I'm a nerd and I enjoy Legos. I will use the back of them. Usually I have my notebook over here, but apparently I forgot it. Okay, so the way this works, forgive the terrible drawings, is you have, okay, I'm drawing things out here, so pardon me. Okay. All right. This circle represents the number of seats in Parliament. Oh, great. I think it's reversed for you. That's delightful. Well, hopefully when I get to actually put this up on YouTube proper, I will flip it. But regardless, you can see that here you have all the seats in Parliament, okay? 50% on one side, 50% on the other. What we're going to do is in a mixed electoral system, we want to make sure that people still have local representation. And the only way to do that is through single member districts. Like, I may not like my congressperson, but I know who I call if I have concerns about things in my district. If we don't have single member districts, then like if I have a problem, who do I call? There's no one living around me. There's no one who's in tune with my issues. So what's going to happen is 50% of all the seats in Parliament or in legislature are going to be SMD. I can't write backwards, so you're just going to have to deal. All right. So 50% of the seats are going to be SMD over here. All right. So far, absolutely normal. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the percentage of seats in Parliament so far. Okay. And when people go to the polls for this election, they're going to vote twice, not just once. They're going to vote once for their own local representative. It'd be like me going to the polls and voting for Mr. Loudermilk, who is currently the congressperson from my district, okay? So it'd be like me going and checking for, Mr. Loudermilk or for his opponent, whoever is running. So I would vote for my local representative. And everyone would vote for their local representative, and whoever won the most seats, votes in each seat would get that seat, no problem. And then what you do is you look at it and you say, oh, okay, so the Republicans won 75% of the seats in the House of Representatives, and then the remaining 25 was split between Democrats and Libertarians, whatever. But the second vote every person gets to choose is for their preferred party. So maybe that means that lots of people actually really like the Green Party, or really like the Libertarian Party, or really like the Social Democratic Party, or the Democratic Party, whatever it is that you like. And so on your second vote, you vote for the party whose platform most appeals to you. Okay. And then what we do is we look and we see how those percentages match up with what's seated in Parliament or Congress right now. So if 75% of the seats currently are going to Republicans, but on a national level, only 50% of the population liked Republican platforms, well, then the Republicans are overrepresented. And what you do is you replace one person into the other 50% of Parliament over here as proportional representation. You add one seat at a time for the other parties left out until you closely represent the actual political breakdown of the country. So you have half the seats that represent actual physical districts and the other half that represents sort of the ideology of the country. And that is a mixed electoral system. If you go to, and I kind of got weird in terms of the way I explained that. That wasn't the cleanest of explanations. My apologies. But if you go to the Unit 2 resources page on the class blog, the video that I showed you about mixed member proportional, which is what that's called, mixed electoral system, is up there. It's the one that has to do with like Kiwi Island. Yeah. Okay. If you go back and watch it, hopefully it'll help you a little bit. Okay, so back to the questions here in chat. Let's see. Benson wants to know, how does Brexit conflict with the Good Friday Agreement? Oh, Benson, better question might be, how doesn't it conflict? Okay, so conflict, I can't talk. My accents are in the wrong places. So the Good Friday Agreement is the document that was signed by the IRA and other combatant groups, as well as the government of the UK and Northern Ireland, to try and draw an end to the Troubles, the period of intensified conflict going from the 1960s up until the mid-1990s along the border of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Although, frankly, the violence wasn't limited to just Ireland itself. It was also found in Great Britain. There were car bombings in London, all sorts of stuff. Anyway, so in order to try and draw an end to the conflict, one of the things that was required was that the IRA would have to lay down its weaponry, which was extensive. Northern Ireland would get an assembly that would be proportionally representative so that Catholic minorities would be able to have a voice. Excuse me. And that the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland would remain open. It'd be a soft and permeable border. That meant that people could travel easily from one side to another. This was especially important to people who had family on both sides of the both sides of the border. So they wanted to be able to travel easily. Now, the big problem with that, obviously, with Brexit, is that the Republic of Ireland to the south is a member of the EU and has no intention of leaving the EU. Northern Ireland, as part of the UK, is in the middle of trying to leave the EU, even though most people in Northern Ireland didn't want to. This is a real problem because the UK is not currently part of the Schengen area, but it does have to adhere to EU regulations with regards to asylum seeking and migrants of that sort. Okay, so there is some degree of free movement of people into the UK as a result of this. Additionally, because of EU policies, essentially, if you enter one EU country, you can enter all of them. If you've been approved, if you fly into Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, you could traverse easily into Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and then from Northern Ireland go to London. And that was totally legal. But by leaving the EU, the UK pulls out of borders and customs control. That is, they wouldn't have EU border operators anymore. They would have to provide their own border infrastructure, which they haven't done in years. Okay, so they would have to provide border infrastructure. Additionally, if people from the Republic of Ireland wanted to enter Northern Ireland, then they'd be moving from the European Union into a non-EU country that has no treaties with the EU. And as a result, you would need a visa or a passport in order to cross that border, which would therefore harden that border. And the fear is that this will essentially negate the decisions made by oh, it's not backwards for you guys. I'm glad to see that. The drawing that I did, it's backwards to me, which is deeply confusing. Okay, but at any rate, I've lost it entirely. That would mean that it would negate the decisions of the Good Friday Agreement. So this is a real concern. It's one that is one of the major stumbling blocks that is holding up the ability of the UK to be able to negotiate an actual deal as they leave the European Union. And if you don't think it's a big deal, I would really encourage you to consider how you think about terrorism and how people thought about terrorism in the 1980s. Because prior to 1996, 97, if you talked about terrorism, they were likely to think of Ireland as the first and foremost place where it was ongoing in the developed world, not anything to do with the Middle East. It was an Irish problem. Okay. Let's see here. What other questions have I got? Leanna wants to know, can I explain what interregnum is? Okay. So an interregnum is the period between kings. Okay, regnum having to do with kingship. It's coming from the same term as like Regina or, regent, that sort of thing. So it has to do with kingship. Inter between. So an interregnum is the period between a king. So like, in particular, the interregnum we're talking about there is the interregnum between Charles I and Charles II. After Charles I gets his head chopped off, then there's an interregnum where Oliver Cromwell and briefly his son rule England until they're removed. Well, one dies and then the other is removed, and Charles II comes back to power, restoring the monarchy. So there you go. All right. Katie has a question about what the difference is between the European Economic Area and the Eurozone. Excellent question, Katie. Okay. So, this is where I would love to be able to screen share with you, but since YouTube Live has decided to make their thing less functional, that's obnoxious. I'd love to be able to show you a map. Okay, but basically the Eurozone is a group of countries that have decided to use the euro as their common currency. Okay, basically it includes all of the European Union except the UK, Denmark, Sweden, I think it's Sweden, and there's one other place that I can't remember. Everybody else uses the euro, okay? The European Economic Area is a free trade zone that is all of the European Union plus 3 other countries. And it's like Norway and Iceland and Liechtenstein. So those 3. And so Norway and Iceland and Liechtenstein are not members of the EU, but they do have the ability to trade in the European Economic Area. This is what, in one of your readings on Brexit, the writer was referring to as the Norway deal, that this would be something that the UK kind of wants, would be to have kind of the situation of Norway, meaning that they'd have access to the European Economic Area, which is essentially the European single market for our purposes. But that means that you don't have a lot of trade barriers. And the problem is that to be a part of the European Economic Area, you have to pay dues to the European Union. You have to obey most European laws, and you don't get a seat at the European Parliament. So you have to pay money, don't get any representation, and obey the laws, but you get access to the free trade area. And there are a few exemptions in terms of what you don't have to do in terms of European regulations, most of which have to do with things like farming, fishing, and environmental stuff. So that's the European Economic Area in comparison to the Eurozone. So the Eurozone is talking specifically about currency. The European Economic Area is talking about a trade area, and sort of the policies by which people can participate in the European single market. Okay, hopefully that's clear. Let's see here. I know I have some other questions on B-Day that popped up here. So let's see here. Okay. Let me look. All right, Nina wants to know, what effect does common law have on UK politics? Good question, Nina. Okay, so common law is the basis of UK law. Common law is the notion that if something has been done long enough and is deemed kind of the normal way of doing things by enough people, it has therefore the weight of law behind it. So it doesn't have to be written down, or say, like in our constitutional case, like ratified by various states or provinces or anything, but rather that if it has been done long enough by enough people, it has the weight of law and therefore can be treated as part of the constitutional bedrock of a country. All right. So in UK common law, things that make up common law can be the traditional status of the City of London, which is incredibly autonomous in comparison to everything else. It can be the Magna Carta being, this document that has been reissued and reissued and reissued, but establishes sort of this notion of legal equality among people who live in the UK. It also establishes the notion of sort of parliamentary independence. All of those things are part of UK common law. Let's see here. Okay, that's a good one too. Okay. All right. So yeah, common law is basically just the whole body of tradition and law that is brought together to make sort of the legal basis of the United Kingdom. And then Priyanka had a question, and she wanted to know, let me go back to it before I forget here. She wanted to know, could I please go over Quangos, Act of Union, and Norman invasion? Sure thing. Okay. First and foremost, Quangos, quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organization. Quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organization. So Quangos came into being on a regular basis sort of during the Thatcherite period. The period between 79 and 91 is when you saw a lot of Quangos develop, because they were a way of shrinking the bureaucracy of the state, and instead, things that used to have been done by the state prior to, say, like 1985, you could kind of shove them off onto Quangos. They were quasi-autonomous, meaning that technically the state didn't control them, but the state did have still some oversight powers. They could still get onto you for doing things incorrectly. So what you would do is you would delegate things like public housing to Quangos, these quasi-autonomous non-governmental organization that would then deal with housing issues, that sort of stuff. Okay, so that's what a Quango is. And they're mentioned in your reading, and they do a pretty decent job of explaining them. I've never seen them come up on the AP exam, but it doesn't mean that they wouldn't be a good example to provide in, say, a short answer. Okay. Let's see. The other question was the Act of Union. So the Act of Union, pardon me. My apologies. Talk for long enough, you need a sip of something. So the Act of Union was the statement by which, look and double check because I don't want to tell you incorrectly. It's not the same thing as the Act of Supremacy, and I think it's the one that pulls the Kingdom of Scotland and Kingdom of England together, but I just want to double check. Oh, no, I lied. Oh, okay. Actually, there are two Acts of Union, so one of them I'm correct about. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the Act of Union in 1603 is the one that pools Scotland and England together. There's that one. But the Act of Union in 1707 establishes Parliament's ability to choose essentially the monarch. It resets the royal family is what it does. It basically goes like, we are going to start at this point. This is where we're going to start the royal family. This is where we define inheritance as, and then they go from there. Okay, that's what it is. And then the other question she had was on, let's see here. Yeah, okay. Her other question was the Norman invasion. So the Norman invasion was in 1066, and it was where you had William the Conqueror coming from Normandy in France, invading into what was then the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and fighting off Harold Godwinson for the kingship of England and establishing the continuous line of monarchy in the UK, which we see today. Essentially, the big thing to know about the Norman invasion is that it's how French and Latinized language gets into the UK. It's how feudalism gets into the UK, and it establishes sort of more European sentiments and understandings about kingship than had previously existed. But because it has to merge with the existing Anglo-Saxon notion of elected kingship, kings that developed in England were always less powerful and more subject to oversight from local lords than other forms of kingship in, say, Western Europe. That's an important thing to know. And then I have some other questions. Okay, so Jalen wants to know, is common law exempt from abstract review? No. Couple of things about that. So common law broadly is not an individual piece of legislation. That's not what it is. Common law is the notion of something that has never been written down, but has been around for so long that it is the way things are done. And broadly speaking, common law isn't overturnable, because it's all subject to interpretation anyway. And common law tends to be fairly flexible. And because it's not written down, you can legislate around it. So it's not really that big of a deal. Abstract review is the notion that something is unconstitutional in comparison with constitutional or common law. So usually what would happen is you'd have a piece of legislation issued by Parliament, and people would look at it and they go, no, but this violates common law, not common law violates this piece of legislation. It doesn't go that way. It goes more legislation violates common law rather than common law violates legislation. Okay? And let's see here. I have another question coming from Claire. Oh, okay. Can I explain what the third way is and why it is important? So the third way is mentioned in your reading. I never talked about it in class. Some things I don't, okay? The third way is in reference to Tony Blair's prime ministership and his view of Labour Party politics, okay? So during the Thatcherite period from 79 to 91, Labour Party broadly saw itself in stark opposition to Margaret Thatcher, but they continuously failed at elections. Their electoral politics weren't able to gain seats. Part of that was due to the fact that Labour tended to be very staunchly in favor of maintaining, say, organized labor rights, unions, sort of the hardcore center of Labour politics. However, by the middle of the 1980s to the end of the 1980s, people in London were starting to see their income start to gradually slope up. Not so for, say, people in industrial centers up in the north of England or in Scotland. It was still not really great for them. But that really made people very, very unwilling to kind of move away from the Thatcherite policies that had developed, especially those which kind of cut the size of the central government and really made a lot of different budget cuts. So what you saw was, under the leadership of Tony Blair, starting in the middle of the 1990s, he proposed that there was a third way meaning like not fully conservative, not old school Labour policies, but there was something that you could do that was kind of in the middle. And Tony Blair saw himself as this voice for a new third way, which embraced some neoliberal policies, including free trade agreements and things like that, a very close economic relationship with the United States. He and Bill Clinton got on quite well. But more of an emphasis on social democratic policies that Thatcher would have otherwise cut. So the third way, therefore, is referencing sort of trying to find this middle ground between the austerity of Thatcher and sort of the ballooning national debt that had emerged at the turn of the 1970s. Okay, that's what the third way is. So at this point, I believe I have got to all the questions that I am seeing on Remind and in chat. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes max here. If you have any further questions, this would be the time to ask them. And I will check and just make sure that I'm not missing anybody. Okay. I'm not seeing anyone frantically typing. And I don't have anything else coming in over mind. Ah, there we go. Okay. What are the important details of Sinn Féin that you need to know about? Really, the thing you need to know about Sinn Féin is that it is the political party that is most interested in Northern Irish independence from the UK and becoming part of a unified Republic of Ireland. It is a separatist political party. I would be able to name, like, the Scottish Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru, and Sinn Féin as the major separatist parties. That's really it. You shouldn't have to know anything about like who's in charge, because that changes fairly quickly. And remember, when you take the AP exam, they will have written the questions about a year and a half before you take it. Anything else? We feeling pretty okay about this, guys? No, you're not feeling okay about this? What's the problem, Leanna? I'll give you about another minute to come up with questions. Go through your study guide, see if there's anything you want me to answer. Okay, the Greater London Council, Leanna, was disbanded by Margaret Thatcher in, oh gosh, I'd have to look up the date exactly, but I believe it was 1983. And it's a really good example of the power of Parliament in a unitary government style, because, my apologies, in a unitary system, there's no requirement to devolve power to any sort of regional or municipal government. There's nothing requiring that power be granted to those groups, okay? And as a result, therefore, like, you can take power away. There's nothing preventing you from doing so. And so because she felt that the Greater London Council was that was stepping over their bounds, that it was exerting way too much authority, that in some cases it was contradicting the will of Parliament, and she personally felt that it was inefficient and overly expensive, she decided to dissolve it entirely. And as a result of that, London, for a brief period of time, had no central government. Essentially, all London business had to be run out of Parliament. There were riots in the street. It was fun for everybody. But it's a really good example of how in a unitary system, there's no guarantee for devolved power. Okay? So hopefully you will remember that the UK is a unitary system. It's unitary. It's unitary. Don't ever forget that, because later on, this semester or next semester, when I ask you to list off unitary states and you can't, I will be very annoyed. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions? Checking on Remind, still not seeing anything. All right. If you have no further questions, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop broadcasting in just a moment. But if you do have questions that pop up later, okay, my suggestion is come and see me before or after school tomorrow. I will be in my classroom at 7:30. I will stay after for quiz correction until 4:30. So you can always come and see me then. All right. So deep breath, study hard, go back and read the Harkness readings again. Review the readings that you skipped over and instead relied on me for notes. Make sure that you've done all the reading. And make sure that you go back and watch the videos that are on the YouTube, on the Unit 2 study page. I can't talk now. So there you go. Hopefully this was helpful, guys. And I will see you tomorrow. Have a good evening.